The Arrival of Buddhism. In 552 AD, a Korean king from Baekje sends a golden Buddha statue and sutras to the Japanese court as a diplomatic gift, and it immediately splits Japan's most powerful clans into a holy civil conflict. The pro-Buddhist Soga clan says, "Adopt it." The Mononobe and Nakatomi clans, guardians of the native kami worship that would later be called Shinto, say this foreign god will anger our gods. The Soga win the argument, and eventually an actual war, and Buddhism floods in, bringing something bigger than religion. It's Japan's pipeline to Chinese civilization. Writing, architecture, medicine, bureaucracy, art, and philosophy all ride in on Buddhism's back. But here's the uniquely Japanese move. Instead of replacing Shinto, the two fuse. Kami get treated as protectors of Buddhas, shrines and temples share grounds. And to this day, most Japanese people are born Shinto, marry Christian style, and get buried Buddhist without seeing any contradiction. That religious flexibility, syncretism, becomes a defining trait of Japanese culture forever. The Taika Reforms. In 645 AD, Japan looks across the sea at Tang Dynasty China, the most advanced civilization on the planet at the time, and decides to copy the entire operating system. But first, a coup. Prince Naka no Oe and his ally Nakatomi no Kamatari assassinate the head of the overpowered Soga clan in front of the empress mid-ceremony, then use the power vacuum to launch total reform. All land is declared property of the emperor and redistributed to farmers, who now pay taxes in rice, cloth, and labor directly to the state. A Chinese-style bureaucracy with ranked officials replaces clan-based rule. A permanent capital is planned. Provinces and districts get drawn on a map with appointed governors. This is the moment Japan stops being a loose confederation of feuding families and becomes a centralized state with an emperor at the top. And the imperial line established here is the same one sitting on the throne today, the oldest continuous monarchy on Earth. Kamatari, by the way, gets rewarded with a new family name, Fujiwara, the clan that will quietly puppet master Japanese politics for the next 500 years. The Heian Court. In 794, the capital moves to Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, and the aristocracy spends the next 4 centuries until 1185 perfecting poetry, calligraphy, seasonal fashion, and world-class passive aggression while completely ignoring the countryside. These are people who judged your entire romantic worth by your handwriting. A love letter with bad penmanship wasn't just rejected, it was passed around court and mocked, medieval ratioed. That obliviousness matters. While nobles debate incense blends, provincial warrior families are quietly handling taxes, land disputes, and security, accidentally incubating the samurai class that will eventually replace them. But culturally, this era is a supernova. Court women, locked out of serious Chinese writing, invent hiragana, the flowing phonetic script, and then use it to lap the men entirely. Sei Shonagon writes the Pillow Book, and Murasaki Shikibu writes The Tale of Genji, widely considered the world's first novel, written around the year 1000. The Heian aesthetic, mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness that beautiful things are fleeting, becomes the emotional DNA of Japanese art. From haiku to Studio Ghibli films to why anime keeps hitting you with cherry blossoms during sad scenes. The Genpei War. From 1180 to 1185, 2 samurai superclans, the Taira, who dominate the court, and the Minamoto, who want them dead, drag all of Japan into 5 years of total war, and the outcome rewires the country's power structure for 7 centuries. The Minamoto win behind their brilliant, doomed general Yoshitsune, and the ending sets the tone for the entire samurai era. At the final sea battle of Dan no Ura, the losing Taira grandmother takes the 6-year-old child emperor in her arms and jumps into the sea rather than surrender. Dramatic, absolute, 0 participation trophies. Clan leader Minamoto no Yoritomo then does something revolutionary. Instead of moving to Kyoto and playing courtier, he stays in Kamakura and gets the court to grant him the title Sei Taishogun, shogun. He builds a parallel military government, the Bakufu, that controls the army, the land, and the law, while the emperor keeps his throne, his rituals, and precisely 0 actual power. This template, sacred figurehead upstairs, military rule downstairs, runs Japan until 1868, and it's why shogun and samurai are global vocabulary words. The war also births Japan's greatest literary epic, The Tale of the Hiker, whose opening line about impermanence gets memorized by schoolkids to this day. The Mongol Invasions. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and ruler of the largest land empire in human history, sends Japan letters demanding submission, and Japan responds by executing his envoys. So he invades twice. The first fleet in 1274 lands at Hakata Bay with gunpowder bombs and coordinated tactics the samurai used to formal one-on-one duels have never seen. Then a storm mauls the fleet and it withdraws. Japan spends 7 years building coastal walls. In 1281, Kublai returns with around 4,000 ships and 140,000 men, one of the largest naval invasion forces ever assembled anywhere until D-Day, though marine archaeologists have since found the sunken wrecks and discovered many were hastily built riverboats, structurally doomed the moment the ocean got moody. The walls hold the Mongols on the beaches for weeks, and then a massive typhoon obliterates the armada. The Japanese conclude the gods themselves sent the storms and name them kamikaze, divine wind, planting a belief in Japan's supernatural protection that echoes for 700 years, all the way to the suicide pilot units of World War II that borrowed the name. The invasions also bankrupt the Kamakura shogunate. There's no conquered land to pay the samurai with. The warrior class grows bitter, and the government that saved Japan collapses within 50 years. Winning, it turns out, can also ruin you. The Sengoku Period. The Ashikaga shogunate implodes in the Onin War of 1467, and Japan spends the next 130 years until 1600 in a nationwide free-for-all where every warlord, daimyo, with a castle and an attitude fights everyone else. Central authority effectively stops existing, and betrayal becomes such standard practice that the era coins its own word for it, Gekukujo, the low overthrowing the high. Corporate ladder climbing, except the ladder is made of your former boss. Sounds like pure chaos, and it was. But it's also one of history's great pressure cookers. Castle engineering leaps forward, professional standing armies replace seasonal peasant levies, and espionage networks flourish. This is the actual historical era of the ninja, who were less magic shadow warriors and more freelance spies and saboteurs from regions like Iga and Koga. Merchants and free cities like Sakai boom because warlords need cash and weapons. Social mobility explodes. The era's eventual unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, starts life as a peasant sandal bearer and ends it ruling Japan. Impossible in any other century. And this era is Japan's pop culture gift to the world. Nearly every samurai game, anime, and film, Sekiro, Neo, Kurosawa's epics, mines this exact century of chaos. Guns at Nagashino. In 1543, a Portuguese ship wrecks on Tanegashima Island carrying matchlock rifles, and Japan, mid-Civil War and highly motivated, reverse engineers them within months. Within a few decades, Japanese smiths are producing more firearms than all of Europe combined, with upgrades like standardized calibers and rain covers for the firing mechanism. Warlord Oda Nobunaga, the era's great disruptor, sees what guns really mean. Individual skill is out, massed firepower is in. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deploys roughly 3,000 gunners behind wooden barricades, organized into rotating volleys so the fire never stops, and deletes the Takeda cavalry, the most feared shock force in Japan, in a single afternoon. Medieval warfare in Japan effectively ends that day, decades before European armies fully professionalize the same tactics. And then history's strangest epilogue. After unification, the Tokugawa government essentially uninvents guns, restricting production so severely that when foreigners return 250 years later, Japan has regressed to swords. The most successful arms control program ever, achieved by having 0 wars to need arms for. Nobunaga himself rides his momentum to control a third of Japan before being betrayed by his own general and dying in a burning temple in 1582. The Battle of Sekigahara. Toyotomi Hideyoshi dies, leaving a 5-year-old heir, and Japan's warlords split into 2 coalitions. The Western Army, loyal to the Toyotomi, and the Eastern Army behind Tokugawa Ieyasu. The patient, calculating survivor who's been waiting his entire life for exactly this. On October 21, 1600, around 160,000 samurai collide in a foggy mountain valley in the single largest samurai battle ever fought. On paper, the Western Army has better numbers and position. In reality, Ieyasu has spent months writing letters. And mid-battle, Kobayakawa Hideki's 15,000 men come charging down the mountain, into their own side. The Western Army disintegrates in about 6 hours. Kobayakawa gets rewarded handsomely for the battle-deciding betrayal, then dies 2 years later despised by both sides. Even the people he saved thought he was gross. Ieyasu becomes shogun in 1603, moves the center of power to a fishing town called Edo, which will grow into Tokyo, eventually the largest city on earth. and his dynasty rules for 268 nearly war-free years. The battle also hardens Japan's future. Domains that fought against Ieyasu, like Satsuma and Choshu, get punished and nurse the grudge for 2.5 centuries, and their descendants are exactly the ones who overthrow the Tokugawa in 1868. Sakoku, the closed country. The Tokugawa shogunate watches European traders and missionaries operate, notices that Spanish colonization tends to arrive shortly after Spanish priests, sees Christianity spreading to hundreds of thousands of converts, including armed rebels in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, and slams the entire country shut with the final exclusion edict of 1639. Christianity is banned and brutally suppressed, foreign ships are turned away, and Japanese citizens are forbidden from leaving on pain of death. So absolute that shipwrecked fishermen rescued by foreign vessels were often barred from ever coming home. Survive a shipwreck, lose your citizenship. All Western trade squeezes through a single fan-shaped artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki harbor, staffed by the Dutch, who got the contract mainly by promising not to preach. But Sakoku wasn't a total blackout. Trade continued with China, Korea, and the Ryukyus, and a trickle of Western science called Rangaku, Dutch learning, kept Japanese scholars weirdly current on anatomy, astronomy, and ballistics. The result of 200-plus sealed years, total peace, a literate urban population, an Edo of over 1 million people, and a cultural hothouse where kabuki, haiku, sushi, sumo as spectator sport, and ukiyo-e woodblock prints all crystallize into the traditional Japan aesthetic the world instantly recognizes today. The Black Ships. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry steams into Edo Bay with 4 warships, 2 of them coal-powered, belching black smoke, unlike anything Japan has seen, and delivers a letter from the US president with a simple subtext: "Open your ports for trade and refueling, or we will be back with more ships and you will not enjoy it." Perry demanded a yes or no answer and refused to leave the bay without one, which, incidentally, is exactly the energy you should bring to the subscribe button right now. He had steam-powered cannons, I have a like counter, and mild anxiety, so subscribe, comment your favorite era below, and hit like, because unlike Perry, I said please. Japan's coastal defenses are running on 250-year-old technology. The shogunate does the math and signs the Convention of Kanagawa in 1854, followed by the humiliating unequal treaties that give foreigners legal immunity and strip Japan of control over its own tariffs. The psychological damage is bigger than the economic damage. The shogun's one job was protecting Japan. He visibly failed. And the country splits between expel the barbarians, hardliners, and modernizers who realize the only way to resist the West is to out-West the West. Within 15 years, the 268-year Tokugawa dynasty is gone. The Meiji Restoration. In 1868, samurai from the grudge-holding domains of Satsuma and Choshu overthrow the shogun, restore the teenage Emperor Meiji to nominal power, and then do something almost unheard of in history. The winning warrior class voluntarily dismantles its own privileges to save the nation. Feudal domains become prefectures, the class system is scrapped, samurai lose their stipends and swords, and a conscript army of commoners takes over defense. The government builds railroads, telegraphs, shipyards, and factories, imposes universal education and a Western-style constitution in 1889 with an elected parliament, and adopts the slogan Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army. The famous Iwakura mission spends nearly 2 years touring America and Europe, literally comparison shopping for institutions. British Navy, Prussian Army and Constitution, French police, American public schools, and the government hires hundreds of foreign experts at absurd salaries, some paid more than cabinet ministers, then systematically replaces every single one with a trained Japanese national. Knowledge transfer, speedrun edition. In a single generation, Japan jumps from feudal agriculture to industrial power, the fastest modernization in human history to that point, and the explicit blueprint later studied by developing nations across Asia. The cost, emperor worship and militarism get baked into the new state's foundations, a bill that comes due in the 1930s. The Satsuma Rebellion. In 1877, the samurai class, stripped of stipends, swords, top-knots, and purpose, boils over in a final armed revolt led by Saigo Takamori, one of the Restoration's own heroes, and the man Western pop culture later mythologizes as the last samurai. The irony is total. Saigo rebels against the very government he co-founded 9 years earlier. Around 30,000 disgruntled ex-samurai from Satsuma march against the state, and they're met by the new conscript army. farmers and merchants' sons with modern rifles, artillery, telegraph coordination, and steamship logistics. The rebellion is crushed in 9 months, ending with Saigo's death after a last stand at Shirayama. The message is brutal and final. Birthright warriors lose to organized commoners with industrial weapons, and 700 years of warrior-class rule is over. Not just legally, but militarily. The government's victory validates conscription and cements the modern army. And yet Japan immediately falls in love with the loser. Saigo becomes a folk hero, the embodiment of sincere principle against cold modernity, and the same government that killed him pardons him posthumously and puts up a statue of him in Ueno Park, walking his dog. Japan's most beloved traitor is memorialized mid-stroll. The Russo-Japanese War. Japan and Russia both want Korea and Manchuria. And in February 1904, Japan, a nation that was feudal 40 years earlier, opens the war with a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, a move the world will remember when Pearl Harbor happens 37 years later. The land war in Manchuria is a horrifying preview of World War I. Trenches, machine guns, barbed wire, hundreds of thousands of casualties. But the defining moment is at sea. Russia sends its Baltic fleet on an 18,000 nautical mile, 7-month voyage around the entire planet, during which it nearly starts a war with Britain by panic firing on English fishing boats, only to be annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905 by Admiral Togo in barely 24 hours, losing most of its ships while Japan loses 3 torpedo boats. 7 months of sailing around the planet to be functionally deleted in a day. It's the first modern war in which an Asian power defeats a European great power, and the shockwave is global. Nationalists from India to Vietnam take it as proof that Western dominance is not a law of physics, while Russia's humiliation feeds directly into its 1905 revolution, the dress rehearsal for 1917. For Japan, victory brings great power status, Korea as a protectorate, and a dangerous national lesson that daring wars against bigger opponents pay off. The Great Kanto Earthquake. At 11:58 a.m. on September 1st, 1923, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake ruptures beneath the Tokyo-Yokohama region. Lunchtime, when half the city is cooking over open charcoal stoves in dense wooden neighborhoods. The shaking is catastrophic, but the fire is apocalyptic. Whipped by typhoon winds, firestorms consume the city for 2 days, and in one horror, a fire tornado sweeps an open depot where nearly 40,000 people had fled with their belongings, killing almost all of them in minutes. Total dead, over 100,000. Something darker follows. Rumors falsely blaming Korean residents for poisoning wells spread through the chaos, and vigilante mobs massacre thousands of Koreans, a stain that remains a live political controversy in Japan today. The rebuilding transforms the capital with wider roads, parks designed as fire breaks, and modern concrete construction. One reason central Tokyo looks so new is that the old city literally burned down twice in one generation, once here and once in 1945. This disaster is also the founding trauma behind Japan becoming Earth's most obsessive seismic engineering nation. Every Tokyo skyscraper that sways but survives, every phone that shrieks seconds before shaking starts, is this earthquake's paranoid grandchild. September 1st is now National Disaster Prevention Day, when the whole country runs drills. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After years of Pacific War firebombed cities, the March 1945 Tokyo raid alone killed roughly 100,000 people in one night. And a fanatical no-surrender doctrine, the United States drops Little Boy on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Fat Man on Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9th. Combined deaths exceed 200,000 by year's end, most of them civilians, many dying slowly of burns and radiation sickness medicine didn't yet understand. In between the two bombs sits one of history's most staggering survival stories. Engineer Tsutomu Yamaguchi is in Hiroshima on business. On August 6th, survives, takes a train home to Nagasaki, and survives the second bomb 3 days later, living to 93 as an officially recognized double survivor. The Soviet Union declares war the same week, and on August the 15th, Emperor Hirohito announces surrender by radio. The first time most ordinary Japanese have ever heard his voice, with the era-defining understatement that the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Japan becomes the only nation ever attacked with nuclear weapons, and that trauma is welded permanently into the national identity. The 3 non-nuclear principles, peace education in every school, Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park preserved as a global never again, and the survivors, Hibakusha, testifying against nuclear weapons for decades, work that fed into a Nobel Peace Prize for their movement in 2024. The Post-War Constitution and Article 9. The American occupation under General MacArthur rewrites Japan's operating system, and when Japanese officials produce a draft too close to the old imperial constitution, MacArthur's staff drafts a new one themselves in about a week. What comes out, taking effect on May 3, 1947, is radical. Sovereignty moves from the emperor to the people. The emperor becomes a purely symbolic figure after publicly renouncing his divinity. Women gain the vote and constitutional equality, helped by 22-year-old staffer Beate Sirota Gordon, who personally fought the women's rights clauses into the text. And Article 9 declares that Japan forever renounces war and will never maintain war potential. Think about that. A document drafted by foreign occupiers in days, partly by a 22-year-old, became so beloved that Japanese voters have refused to change a comma of it for 8 decades. The world's oldest unamended constitution and history's most successful group project. Article 9 defines modern Japan. It's why the country fields self-defense forces instead of a military, why Japan sheltered under the US security umbrella and poured its budget into industry instead of arms, and why every attempt to revise it, an ambition of multiple prime ministers, triggers a national political earthquake. The economic miracle. From the 1950s through the 1980s, a bombed-out, occupied nation with no natural resources becomes the world's second-largest economy in under 25 years. And it isn't luck, it's a system. The Korean War turns Japan into America's factory and logistics base, injecting billions. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry steers banks towards strategic sectors: steel, ships, cars, electronics. Companies offer lifetime employment and get fanatical loyalty back. Workers practice Kaizen, continuous improvement, hunting inefficiencies daily. And here's the twist buried in the whole system. The quality control philosophy behind it was taught to Japan by an American statistician, W. Edwards Deming, whom American companies had ignored, meaning Detroit spent the 1980s losing to advice it got first. Toyota invents just-in-time manufacturing, now the global standard, and made in Japan flips from meaning cheap tin toys to better than yours. Sony's transistor radios and Walkman, Honda overtaking European motorcycles, Toyota and Nissan invading the US market during the 70s, oil crises with efficient cars, Detroit refused to build. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics is the coming out party. The first games broadcast globally by satellite, timed with the debut of the Shinkansen bullet train, hitting 210 kilometers per hour while American passenger rail was hitting deer. By the 1980s, Japanese firms are buying Rockefeller Center and Columbia Pictures, and American bookstores fill with panicked titles about Japan taking over the world. The bubble economy and the lost decades. The 1985 Plaza Accord strengthens the yen. The Bank of Japan slashes interest rates to keep exports alive, and from 1986 to 1990, all that cheap money floods into stocks and real estate until reality disconnects entirely. At the peak, the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo is theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California combined. The Nikkei hits 38,915 in December 1989. Ginza land hits roughly 30 million yen per square meter, people effectively paying supercar money for the space a supercar parks in. And golf club memberships trade like securities, some costing over $1 million. Companies borrow against inflated land to buy more inflated land. A perpetual motion machine of pure vibes. Then the Bank of Japan raises rates, and the machine runs in reverse. Stocks lose more than half their value, land prices collapse for over a decade, and banks stuffed with worthless collateral keep zombie companies alive rather than admit losses. Japan enters the lost decade. Deflation, stagnant wages, hiring freezes that scar an entire employment ice age generation, and a national mood shift from swagger to caution that shapes everything from birth rates to career choices. The Nikkei doesn't reclaim its 1989 peak until 2024, a 34-year round trip, and turning Japanese becomes central banker slang for the fate every economy is trying to avoid. The Tokyo Sarin attack. The doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo, founded by a nearly blind former yoga instructor named Shoko Asahara, who preached an approaching apocalypse only his followers would survive. releases sarin nerve gas on 5 Tokyo subway trains during Monday morning rush hour on March 20th, 1995. Cult members puncture bags of liquid sarin with sharpened umbrella tips and walk away as the gas spreads through packed cars converging on the government district. 13 people die, over 1,000 are injured, and thousands more flood hospitals in the worst terrorist attack in Japanese history. The investigation reveals something scarier than the attack itself. Aum had recruited elite chemists, physicists, and doctors from Japan's top universities, amassed assets rivaling a small nation, built a chemical weapons facility disguised as a shrine, attempted to buy military helicopters from post-Soviet Russia, and had already killed before, including a previous sarin attack in Matsumoto in 1994 that investigators failed to trace back to them. The attack shatters Japan's core self-image as the world's safest society, forces a complete overhaul of counter-terrorism, emergency response, and cult regulation, and becomes a global case study as the first major chemical weapons attack by a non-state group. Coming just 2 months after the devastating Kobe earthquake, 1995 hits Japan with a double crisis so profound that scholars treat it as the psychological end of the post-war era. Asahara and 12 senior members were executed in 2018. The Tohoku earthquake and Fukushima. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.1 megathrust earthquake, the most powerful in Japan's recorded history and one of the 5 strongest ever measured anywhere, ruptures off the northeast coast. The quake is so violent it shifts Honshu, Japan's main island, about 2.4 meters east, and shortens Earth's day by roughly 1.8 microseconds by redistributing the planet's mass. Japan's disaster literally moves the world. Japan's engineering mostly passes the test. Buildings sway and survive, bullet trains auto-brake, early warning alarms give seconds of notice. What follows doesn't care about engineering. A tsunami with waves reaching 40 meters in places overtops seawalls, designed for far less, and erases entire coastal towns in minutes. Nearly 20,000 people die, the overwhelming majority by drowning. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, the quake cuts external power and the tsunami drowns the backup generators. Cooling fails and 3 reactors melt down in the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, forcing over 150,000 evacuations. The aftermath rewires Japan. The entire nuclear fleet shuts down for review, flipping the country back toward imported fossil fuels and igniting an energy debate still running today. While seawalls, evacuation planning, and disaster education worldwide get rebuilt on Tohoku's lessons, investigations conclude the nuclear disaster was ultimately man-made, a failure of regulation and imagination, not just nature. 20 events, 1,500 years. One country that got isolated, invaded, industrialized, flattened, bankrupted, and shaken off its own coastline, and somehow came out the other side, giving the world bullet trains, Toyota, the Walkman, and anime. Japan's real superpower isn't tradition or technology. It's the ability to take a catastrophe and turn it into a blueprint. Every disaster on this list became a system. Earthquakes became engineering, defeat became a constitution, isolation became a culture the entire planet now consumes. If this timeline rewired how you see modern Japan, subscribe so the next deep dive lands in your feed. Comment the one event you think deserves its own full video and hit like. It genuinely tells the algorithm this kind of history deserves to exist. See you in the next one.